There comes a point when you've done everything. You've read the books, you've attended therapy, you've set boundaries, confronted your shadow, grieved your losses, and practiced all the techniques. You've fought, healed, processed, released, and rebuilt, but something still hasn't resolved. There's still a weight in the center of your chest, like a stone that won't dissolve no matter how many methods you try. You reach a stage where effort itself becomes the barrier. But no one told you that was possible. No one mentioned that there's a point beyond all the work where the task is to stop working altogether. Carl Jung observed this stage later in his career, and it challenged his entire therapeutic framework. He had spent decades creating methods to confront the unconscious, integrate the shadow, and dismantle false personas. His life's work was based on the belief that consciousness grows through effort, through active engagement with the psyche. Yet, he encountered patients who had done all of that and still hadn't achieved wholeness. They had done the work fully, courageously, and sincerely, yet they remained stuck, not because they hadn't tried hard enough, but because they had reached a threshold where more effort actually blocked what they needed most. Jung called what lay beyond this threshold the Sophia Stage. Named after the ancient archetype of divine wisdom, it wasn't something you could reach through effort or strategy. It was a psychological moment when the ego exhausts its entire repertoire, allowing something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath all the striving, to rise in its place. Jung described it as the moment when the self stops seeking the ego's permission and begins to act independently. But reaching it required what the ego is built never to do: total surrender. Today, I'm going to explore what Jung discovered about the Sophia Stage. Why reaching it means you've already exhausted everything effort could achieve. What truly occurs in the psyche when the only option left is to let go, and why this stage, which feels like the end of the journey, is actually the beginning of the only transformation capable of making you whole. To understand the Sophia Stage, it's important to grasp what Jung observed about the limits of psychological work. He watched patients make remarkable progress through shadow integration. They confronted their darkness, acknowledged their wounds, and took responsibility for unconscious patterns. They became more honest, more self-aware, and better at setting boundaries. By any therapeutic measure, they were healthier. Yet many still reported a persistent emptiness, an underlying sense that something essential remained missing despite their progress. At first, Jung assumed this meant they hadn't gone deep enough. Perhaps there were more layers of shadow to integrate or more unconscious material to uncover. So he guided them further into the work, and they complied. They were committed individuals who trusted the process. They dug deeper, processed more, confronted harder. But the emptiness didn't diminish. If anything, it grew stronger. The more effort they applied, the more the unnamed void at their center resisted. This puzzled Jung, until he noticed a pattern he had overlooked. Every patient who reached this impasse shared one thing: they had come to know themselves profoundly, but they did not trust what lay beyond themselves. They had mastered the psychological terrain of their own mind. They understood their wounds, defenses, patterns, and shadow. They had mapped their inner world with remarkable thoroughness. Yet all of this was still ego-driven, ego-observing ego, conscious mind examining the unconscious. There existed a realm beyond the ego's ability to analyze or control. Jung called this realm the self, with a capital S, the totality of the psyche, which includes but far exceeds conscious awareness. He realized that the Sophia Stage occurs when someone develops the ego to its fullest capacity, and then must surrender that capacity to something greater. Not to abandon it, nor to destroy it, but to release the ego's hold, the control it maintained even during the most sincere psychological work. This is what makes the Sophia Stage so disorienting for those who have done deep inner work. You've built your healing on the belief that awareness leads to change, that understanding patterns breaks them, and that confronting truth sets you free. All of that is real and necessary. Yet there is a limit to what understanding and confrontation alone can accomplish. You've reached it, not because you failed, but because you succeeded at everything effort could achieve. Now you stand at the edge of a realm where your usual tools no longer work, and the only way forward is to set them down. Consider someone who spent years in therapy processing childhood trauma. They fully understand what happened, how it shaped their attachment styles, relationships, and self-concept. They've grieved their losses, expressed anger at what was taken, engaged in forgiveness work, or consciously chosen not to forgive and made peace with that choice. Every angle has been examined, every layer processed. Yet some mornings, a nameless heaviness remains with no origin they can identify. It's not depression, not unresolved grief, but something deeper, existing beneath the reach of therapy. Jung realized this heaviness is the weight of the ego trying to maintain control over a transformation it cannot manage. The psyche is reorganizing at a level beyond the ego, but the ego keeps intervening, analyzing, and applying the familiar tools that once worked. Every attempt is like trying to help a butterfly emerge from its cocoon by forcibly opening it. The help became the harm. The effort itself blocked the very emergence it aimed to support. The Sophia Stage begins the moment you recognize this, not just intellectually, because you may have understood surrender as a concept for years. Intellectual understanding is merely the ego adding another idea to its collection. The Sophia Stage begins when something in your body, your nervous system, your lived experience actually stops reaching. When the hands that were always grasping for the next insight, the next breakthrough simply open. Not because you decide to open them, but because they are too tired to remain closed. Something in you already senses the difference between a tool that fuels the ego's activity and one that allows it to release its grip. The true self-discovery guide was created with this distinction in mind. 24 reflections grounded in Jung's work, focused less on digging deeper and more on noticing what all that digging has already revealed. It's linked in the description. Now, let's explore what Jung observed in patients who truly crossed this threshold, because it transforms what surrender actually looks like. Jung described the Sophia archetype as the embodiment of wisdom that cannot be pursued, only received. In ancient traditions, Sophia was not a goddess to be sought through pilgrimage or prayer. She was wisdom that finds you when you stop seeking. The intelligence of the psyche itself, the deeper ordering principle that heals what the conscious mind cannot. Jung noticed that this intelligence only activated when the ego stopped trying to control everything. This is why the Sophia Stage feels like giving up. From the ego's perspective, surrender is indistinguishable from defeat. The ego interprets the cessation of effort as failure. So when there is nothing left to do, the ego panics. It convinces you that you're regressing, being passive, or wasting all your progress. It floods you with anxiety about what will happen if you stop trying. The ego exists by being needed, by solving problems, by maintaining the illusion that consciousness is produced through effort rather than received through openness. Jung observed that patients in the Sophia Stage often went through a period that looked alarming from the outside. They would lose interest in self-improvement, stop reading psychology books, and cancel therapy sessions, not because they were avoiding the work, but because they had completed the work that was theirs to do and sensed that pushing further was actually blocking something from emerging. Friends and family would worry, "Are you okay? Are you depressed? Why aren't you working on yourself anymore?" The person in the Sophia Stage couldn't explain what was happening because language belongs to the ego, and the ego has no words for this. What was actually occurring, Jung documented, was a reorganization of the psyche beneath conscious awareness. The self was integrating everything the ego had uncovered through years of shadow work, therapy, and self-confrontation. All those insights, all the grieved losses, all the confronted wounds were being woven into a new psychological structure. But this weaving couldn't happen while the ego was still pulling at the threads. The ego had to step back and allow the deeper intelligence to do work it couldn't perceive or direct. Jung compared this to a broken bone healing. You can set it, protect it, and provide the right conditions, but the knitting of bone is a biological process that unfolds on its own timetable. Willpower cannot speed it up. Trying to use the limb too soon doesn't accelerate recovery, it hinders it. The Sophia stage is the psychological equivalent of keeping the cast on and waiting, even when every part of you wants to test whether you're healed. The hardest part of this stage is that it asks you to trust something you cannot see, measure, or verify. After years of developing discernment, questioning, and analyzing, you're now asked to exist in a space where analysis doesn't help and understanding isn't available. You must sit with not knowing, not as a temporary discomfort to endure until the next insight arrives, but as a sustained state that might last months or longer. During this time, you won't be able to tell whether you're transforming or deteriorating, because from the inside, both feel the same. Jung acknowledged that this was the most difficult thing he ever asked of patients, harder than confronting the shadow, facing trauma, or dismantling false identities. All of those tasks, painful as they were, still gave the ego something to do. They allowed the person to feel like an active participant in their own healing. The Sophia stage removes that entirely. You become a witness to your transformation rather than its architect. For those who built their identity around being strong enough to do the work, becoming someone who waits can feel like a kind of death. But it is precisely this death the Sophia stage requires, not the death of the self, but the death of the self as doer. The death of the identity that says, I heal myself through my own effort. The death of the spiritual achiever, the psychological warrior, the one who overcomes. All of those identities served a purpose and were necessary at earlier stages, but now they become the final barrier between you and the wholeness attempting to emerge. Wholeness is not something you construct. It is something you allow, and you cannot allow it while you are still building. Jung observed a distinct shift in patients who successfully navigated this stage. At an unpredictable, unforceable moment, waiting transformed from endurance into peace. Not knowing ceased to feel frightening and became spacious. The absence of effort stopped feeling like failure and started feeling like freedom. Patients often broke into tears, not from sadness, but from the relief of no longer having to hold everything together, realizing something had been supporting them all along, something they couldn't sense while gripping so tightly. This is Sophia wisdom, recognizing that you were never the one doing the real healing. Your effort, necessary as it was, merely cleared the path for a deeper intelligence to act. The ego's role is to prepare the ground and then step aside, and stepping aside is precisely what the ego resists until it literally cannot resist any longer. What emerges on the other side of the Sophia stage is not what most expect. It is not bliss, enlightenment, or the feeling of having arrived. It is quieter, deeper, and more profound. Jung described it as a relationship with the self that no longer requires the ego as mediator, a trust in your own depths that does not depend on understanding, a capacity to move through life without needing to analyze every experience, process every emotion, or understand every pattern before finding peace. People who have passed through the Sophia stage carry a calm that is not performed. It doesn't come from techniques or practices. It comes from having touched the depths of their own psyche and discovering that the bottom held. Beneath all the wounds, shadows, defense mechanisms, trauma responses, and carefully constructed identities, there is something intact, something that was never truly damaged despite everything. Experiencing this, not as an idea, but as lived reality, transforms how you inhabit your life in ways that are hard to articulate, yet impossible to lose. Jung was careful to distinguish this from spiritual bypassing. The Sophia stage isn't about skipping hard work and jumping to acceptance. It is only accessible to those who have already done the hard work thoroughly. You cannot surrender what you haven't first claimed. You cannot let go of control you never actually developed. The Sophia stage requires a fully developed ego, a well-integrated shadow, and a deeply honest relationship with your own psychology. Only then is there something substantial enough to surrender. Only then does letting go mean more than avoidance dressed in spiritual language. This is why Jung positions Sophia at the end of the individuation process, not the beginning. It follows everything else and becomes available only when you have truly exhausted what effort can accomplish. If you are still deep in shadow work, confronting wounds, building boundaries, and developing self-awareness, then the Sophia stage is not yet where you are. Trying to skip ahead to surrender will only delay the work that is currently yours to do. Surrender without prior integration is not wisdom, it is collapse. But if you have done the work, faced what needed facing, grieved what needed grieving, built what needed building, and confronted what needed confronting, and if you have arrived at a place where there is nothing left to do yet something still remains unresolved, then this is where you are. This is the Sophia stage. The only instruction here is the one your ego will resist most strongly: stop trying. Not because effort was wrong, but because effort has served its purpose. What comes next requires a different form of participation, the kind where you show up fully present without an agenda, remain conscious without directing, and stay awake while letting the process itself unfold through you. Jung spent the final years of his career studying patients who reached this stage. What struck him most was how rarely traditional methods could help them. No technique could facilitate the Sophia transition. No intervention could accelerate it. The therapist's role, Jung concluded, was simply to be present, to witness, and to confirm that what the patient was experiencing was not regression or avoidance, but the most advanced stage of psychological development a human can reach. Sometimes, that single act of recognition was enough to allow the person to stop resisting surrender and let it carry them. If you are reading this and feel something in your chest softening, something clenched for years, then you already know what I'm describing. You have been at this threshold, perhaps for a long time, standing at the edge where your tools stop working and something wordless begins. And you have been terrified because the ego interprets this threshold as danger. But Jung would say this threshold is the most important one you will ever cross, not shadow confrontation, not boundary setting, not trauma processing. This moment, where the deepest transformation of your life requires doing the thing that feels most impossible, trusting what you cannot control, allowing what you cannot direct, and receiving what you cannot earn. The Sophia stage is neither comfortable nor quick, and it comes with only one guarantee. What lies beneath everything you've been trying to fix is already whole, already sufficient, already present. You've just been too busy creating it to realize it was already there. When you finally pause long enough to notice, when your hands unclench, your mind quiets, and the effort that defined you falls away, like a coat you've worn so long you forgot it wasn't your skin, what remains is the wisdom that has been waiting all along. Not earned, not achieved, simply received because you became still enough to let it in. This is the Sophia stage. This is what Jung discovered at the end of the individuation journey, not another task, not another confrontation, but a quiet homecoming you might miss if you're still making noise. But by the time you reach this stage, you will be ready to hear it. The silence will contain everything you need. 24 reflections, no tasks, no homework, just ways to be still enough to notice what has been waiting beneath it all. The True Self Discovery Guide is in the description, for whenever the striving finally softens into listening.